Hello, this is Matt Carpenter, and I am honored today to have Thomas Fickley and Father Mark Perkins from St. Dunstan's Academy with me. So they are both, again, they're some of the founders of St. Dunstan's. It is an all boys boarding school in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. So Thomas and Father Mark, welcome.
Thanks for having us, Matt.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
So I've been excited about St. Dunstan's ever since I heard about it a few years ago. And I know you've gotten some traction. I've heard you on several other podcasts, and I know spoken at I believe at the CRC conference a few years ago, or recently even, and also at the Ciceronian Society. So there's great information already out there about St. Dunstan's, but can you just tell us a little bit about the school, and you can start wherever you'd like. What was your motivation, and really what stirred you with the need for a school like this?
Yeah, big picture, St. Dunstan's Academy is a 9th through 12th grade boarding school for young men. And the goal is to make strong disciples, young men who are competent and capable and have a sporting attitude towards life. We founded the school a couple of years ago. It went from an idea on paper to a place in May of 2023. So we obtained our campus just about 3 years ago. And since then, I've been going through the process of getting all the engineering and architecture and permits lined up so that we could start building the school. And last year, we built our first dormitory. That was our first permitted building. We have a couple of students on site now in a gap year program called the Joshua program. The goal of that program is to help young men grow in Christ, grow in competence, and grow up. It's a kind of adventure-filled year of outdoorsmanship, backpacking, hiking, a lot of building arts instruction, and then a rhythm of spiritual life with our chapel and our daily prayer services here. So we have a couple of guys on site now. They're helping build out campus with our faculty, and we're working on the main multi-purpose building for the high school right now, which we're supposed to break ground on any day. Our excavator's brought his equipment out on site. I'm looking at it out the window to my right here, and hopefully on Wednesday or Thursday of this week, we'll be digging the big hole and getting ready to put the foundation in so that we can open up the high school, Lord willing, in the fall of 2027. That's
Wow.
from a big picture perspective where we are in our development. So we currently have gap year students here, and we're hoping to begin accepting our first couple of cohorts of high school students in about a year and a half.
That is wonderful. Americans are somewhat familiar with boarding schools, usually because we read British novels about people who attended boarding schools. But here, more often, I know we have some in the States, but we're more accustomed to just regular day schools. So what is it that stirs you for the need for a boarding school rather than just a normal day school for this?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, and it could go a couple of different directions with this. Here's what I'd say is the starting answer. In any school, you have two things that are teaching at any time. You have the curriculum, which is the formal part on paper and on the website. That's what the faculty is delivering. It's what they talk about in their meetings. It's what parents have formally signed up for. And that's what content is being delivered by the teachers. I would say also by the families, by the churches involved. You have this kind of top-down curriculum that is designed to try and help outfit and equip young people for their life in the kingdom of God. But you also have the culture of the school. So you have the curriculum on one hand, and then you have the culture on the other. And in the time of adolescence, a young person's culture starts coming more and more from their peers and from the media, in addition to their family life and their church life and the actual formal curriculum of their school. And in order to properly enculturate someone, and culture just means helping their soul to grow, right? Like in agriculture. Culture is the soil in which a human soul grows. In order to properly enculturate someone, you need those two things to be meaningfully integrated together. And what we found in our careers as teachers, Father Mark and I both taught for about a decade before we started St. Dunstan's. Father Mark was also a parish priest for a couple of years in between um, teaching at our last school and then teaching here. What we found is that we had an incredibly coherent curriculum, and all of the formal elements of what we were doing were aligned really well. But the student culture was at times at loggerheads with what we were trying to teach. And in the words of our friend Josh Gibbs, culture eats curriculum for breakfast. You can't have a great school curriculum that is not reinforced and bolstered by the students' experience of their friends and their media life. And so, one thing that is really helpful about a boarding school, and this is our intent here, is to make life coherent and integrated so that both in the classroom during school hours and outside of it and all of the extracurriculars and evening time and morning time and then the life of work and song and the things that make life meaningful, all of these things will be blended together under the banner of Christ and under the direction and mentorship of the faculty and their families living here on campus. So it makes for a pretty thick Christian community that can bring coherence to a student's lived experience. Father Mark, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would obviously agree with all that. And I think for me, one of the first things that drew me to the project when Thomas described his vision for it way back in 2021 now, was the way that it was recapturing something of a traditional parish life. And we think of boarding school as sort of outside the norm because it is for most Americans, and we think of the vision for this sort of coherent community and culture that we're building as outside the norm for American life because it is. But it's also in a different way restoring what was the norm for human beings for all of existence until the day before yesterday, historically speaking, which is that your neighborhood, your workplace, your school, and your church were all integrated in the same place. That sort of thick, coherent culture that Thomas is talking about is a sort of restoration in some ways of the traditional parish. And I do think as we continue to move into a sort of more an increasingly dislocated, disembodied age, which we have been already in for decades, I think recovering the vision for life together in an embodied place is really, really important. And you actually need a boarding school in order. Well, a boarding school is at least one solution or one way of getting towards that response.
As a on one hand, former teacher, former full-time teacher. Now my teaching is with my own kids, and it's not full-time the way it was. But I am fascinated and appreciative that St. Dunstan's is an all-boys school. Not that there's anything wrong with teaching girls or at an all-girls school. One historian I remember, John Lukács, taught for years at Chestnut Hill College around Philadelphia, and it was a women's college, and he was a fascinating historian. But I've observed over the years that young men and young women being in the same classroom in the high school age, you have, going back to talking about the culture of a school, there is, again, there's the curriculum, there's their individual lives. There's also, though, the the intermingling of the two that creates some very unique dynamics. So, what is it? I mean, and there's a number of ways that we could go with this, but really what I'm interested in is you were able, I know, to help teach young men in a way that is more that's more focused on their needs without the without having to divert your attention and teach in a different way to the way a young lady needs to learn. So how do young men, in your observation, experience, and research, how do young men learn differently than young women? And how is St. Dunstan's pursuing helping young men learn in the way that they can grow best?
Well, I almost didn't hear any of your question because once you said John Lukács, I stopped listening to the rest of it. John Lukács is one of my great heroes, and I wrote my undergraduate thesis on him. Corresponded with him by phone and letter. He only had a typewriter at his death, and one of my
Oh
great
boy.
yeah, one of my he wrote actually letters of recommendation for me in graduate school my first stint around. So one of my great life regrets is not making the pilgrimage up to Phoenixville, Pennsylvania to see him, but I did just last month. Um, I did just last month actually get to drive by Chestnut Hill College and see the little women's college where he taught. So I'm going to let Thomas answer that question because I'm just so pleased. We were talking before we hit record about all the people that we know in common and the incredible Venn diagram. You might need to cut this from the podcast, but I'm just so tickled.
No. This is great. I mean, this is. So I'm making the note right now that we need to talk about him later.
Yes.
Because as a historian, he's woefully neglected.
Yes.
And I have deep appreciation for him. So we're not going to cut it, but we're just going to hit pause on this amazing.
That'll be the next episode.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, John Lukács gave Father Mark some glowing reviews of his writing about John Lukács, which is pretty neat. I'll toot Father Mark's horn for him there. He said something like, "This is the best understanding of my writing that's come from." Father Mark, how did this comment go?
He said it at the time that it was the best, was the most sort of comprehensive. I wrote about his historical philosophy, and he said it was the best interpretation of his historical philosophy that he'd read. I still have my thesis with all his handwritten sort of notes, which was kind of amazing. He apparently didn't think much of his critics and people who'd written about him because he tore the thing to pieces and then gave it a great compliment at the end. But yeah, wow, that's really wonderful.
Small world. That's great. Yeah, so a couple notes about an all-boys boarding school and what benefits come from that. For one thing, those who have been in a high school classroom before will know exactly what we're talking about here. If in the classroom your goal is to engage the intellects and the souls of the young people in front of you and help them on their soul's journey towards the truth, that takes a lot of focus. It takes a lot of concentration to do that on the teacher's part and on the student's part. There's a Roman Catholic writer named Sertiange, A.G. Sertiange, who we cite frequently here. He has a great definition of vocation. He says vocation means concentration. And in the life of a student, their vocation is to be learning. Well, you take a group of 16 and 17-year-old young men that are engaged in, I don't know, studying Plato or studying A.G. Sertiange. There we go. Excellent. Yeah, you've got yours. I've got mine right here. Look at that. Yeah, so you're trying to talk to them about Aristotle and what it means to search for the truth and where the truth resides. And then a young lady walks in the room, and suddenly that young man has to do two different things, right? He has to try as best as he can to think about the abstract world of the forms, and also try to show off for the young lady who's just come in and show that he has what it takes. And those are two very different things, right? A young man trying to get a young lady's attention is a different thing from a young man trying to understand Plato. Father Mark can attest to this because he met his wife in Spanish class in high school. And ask Padre how his Espanol is these days, and it will be un poquito because Andrea was in class with Padre. So that's one reason why single gender education in high school is actually a very helpful thing. It helps young people concentrate. And I think basically all of the literature at this point attests to that fact. But then the other thing is it has to do with young men and the particular stage of development that they're in. A young man is ceasing to be a boy and entering to the world of mature manhood. And in young men particularly, that process requires rites of passage. It requires a leaving behind of boyishness and a donning of the mantle of mature manhood. And in order to do that, young men need to be in a pretty targeted environment with certain sorts of challenges put in front of them. The traditional sort of process of a rite of passage in any culture around the world involves first leaving the domestic sphere temporarily, and then being initiated through challenge into the group of men, and then being reincorporated into the community with a new identity. And that takes time, and it takes some pretty programmed and organized things. Rites of passage have traditionally been very formal. And in a co-ed classroom, you cannot target that need of young men to be challenged and put through a rite of passage if they're young ladies in the same room. And if you do, what you end up with is that rite of passage, instead of being something where young men are going through it together and gaining this new identity in a band of brothers, it becomes a competitive thing where they're trying to beat each other out for the attention of the young ladies. And we don't think that that's particularly fruitful at that stage of development. So that's one big picture reason why we've decided to have boys together here, young men, and not to have a co-ed boarding school. There are other reasons to not have a co-ed boarding school for 14 to 18-year-olds. And some of those should be obvious. But the main one is that young men and young women they're different. Their needs in adolescence are different, and the way that they need to be taught at many times is different.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, I think again, the primary reason is that anytime you have a mixed gender community, you do not have an adolescent rite of passage in any sort of true way. That in no culture that has ever existed have adolescent rites of passage been mixed gender, because they're profoundly different. So once you have a mixed gender setting, then the rite of passage can't happen in that setting. It can happen elsewhere, but it can't happen in that setting. And if you want your school to do that, you have to do that. The secondary reason that's much less important, but still noteworthy, is that girls and boys develop at a different rate, and for a variety of reasons, the top performers in a school setting tend to be girls, especially in the last few decades. That's becoming increasingly the case. And so if you have a mixed gender classroom and you're going to teach to the kind of top core of your students, you're going to end up teaching. And this is what I realized after the fact, that I would think I was above average attentive. This is in my day school teaching context. I think I was more attentive than most teachers to the needs of the boys in my classroom, but I also was dedicated to teaching to the top 30%, say, of my class, and then pulling the other, 40 or 50% in the middle along with me. And I realized late in the game that I was teaching to that top 30% was almost exclusively girls. There might be one boy, maybe in a particular class, two boys in any given grade level that were in that top group. And then the middle group was about 50-50, and the bottom group was almost exclusively boys. And so you ended up teaching to the girls and creating a sort of girl-centered, girl-defined culture that some of the boys were invited into. And the culture of being bad at school was almost exclusively male. And so one of the ironies of a single-sex education model is that you actually get rid of some unhelpful gender stereotypes when you make it mixed gender. We were at a conference and heard a young man who went to a boys boarding school in high school talk about by the time he got into high school, he thought that that student government, that the honor roll, that the play, there was one other example, that journalism, the school newspaper, these were all things girls did. And then he went to an all boys school and realized, well, no, if there's going to be a newspaper, boys are going to have to do it. And so you actually get to avoid some unhelpful gender stereotypes. And you get to say, no, the top students are all going to be boys, and the bottom students are all going to be boys. And you don't end up with the sort of very unhelpful gender stereotyping around academic achievement, which is almost universal in our culture, and becoming increasingly a problem for boys as girls continue to seem to outpace boys educationally and academically in America. So that's a secondary reason. That's not the primary reason for it. It just happens to be a really, really useful thing as well.
Which I find fascinating for a number of reasons. One of which, though, is part of the reason we have co-ed classrooms is because of egalitarianism. That we're afraid and have been afraid that one sex's education would be better than the other. But actually, Father Mark, what you just described, in a way, turns egalitarianism on its head, because what that means is that everyone will, those supposedly gender roles that just sort of come up in co-ed schools cannot come up. So there is a different type of equality that asserts itself within there being still well, segregation, which is in this case, that of the sexes. So anyway, that is it. I want to think more about that because I really
Yeah, and
like what
if you do, Matt, if you do want to look into that a little bit more, there's a Brookings Institute sociologist named Richard Reeves who wrote a book a couple of years ago called Boys and Men, and a lot of what he is cataloging in there is the now very definitive gender gap that has emerged in particularly secondary schools between boys and girls, young men and young women, and some of the implications for what we need to be doing to help our young men so that they don't essentially just check out of education and say this is something for girls.
Mm.
The gender gap now, this is just a very brief point, the gender gap now in metrics like high school graduation rates, college admission rates, honor roll, there's a greater gender gap now than there was when Title IX was passed back in the 70s, but reversed. And so this is something we really do need to be paying attention to if we want our young men to do well in school and if we care about them feeling like their needs are being seen.
Yeah, and those gaps are widening now, whereas even before Title IX was passed, they were narrowing. Now it's wider and widening. The other thing I'd add is that when you have a mixed gender vision for any culture or community, I think you have two options for what actually happens. One is an androgynous community where you're not actually honoring equal sexes. You're trying to eliminate sex difference altogether, and I'd say that's a big part of our sort of contemporary contemporary culture. And we talk about masculinity not as opposed to femininity, but as opposed to, on the one hand, androgyny, the sort of erasure of sex difference as a significant category, and on the other hand, mature masculinity, manhood, as opposed to boyhood. And so we want to say boyhood is wonderful until a boy has to grow up, and then an overgrown boy is not a good thing. And so we talk about manhood as opposed to boyhood, not manhood as opposed to womanhood. So there's the androgynous problem, and then the other problem is that so you get one of two things. You either eliminate sex difference, which is the goal of modern culture in a lot of ways, and I think is a mistaken goal. It's a bad one to begin with. We actually shouldn't celebrate. We should recognize the things that unite us, and if we had more time, we could go on a discursus into Genesis 1 and 2 and the unity of male and female, which is extremely important. But it's a unity in diversity as well. There's interdependence and difference as well. But the other side of it is that you always you end up with partial androgyny, which is bad, and then you also end up with a gendered norm, which is also bad. So you pretend that it's either that it's egalitarian, but you actually have, as Abigail Favale says in the Genesis of Gender, for most of the last couple hundred years, the supposed sex neutral world, including in feminism, was really answering to a male norm, and so women were supposed to become more like men, and that's not actually positive. And then we're seeing actually the sort of interesting reversal of that more recently, where in Reeves' book, which is super helpful and really good with data in a lot of ways, the unstated message over and over again, which he explicitly rejects. He says, I'm not doing this, and then he does it over and over again, not intentionally, I think just implicitly, is that boys would do a lot better if they were just a little bit more like girls, over and over again. And so there's a female norm in the workplace, in parenting, and in education that he has floating around there. And at times they sort of the mask, and it's not a mask because I don't think it's totally conscious, but at times the mask slips a little bit, and he'll sort of say, we need more feminism. Re-envisioned women's lives. Now it needs to re-envision men's lives. Anyway, so there's a whole sort of other deeper societal issues with the lack of sex difference. But
by the way, Father Mark, I'm very impressed that you can concentrate on your answers with that planer running outside. Our students and faculty are working on the timber frame for the Great Hall right now, and Father Mark has been kicked out of the office because we're getting some feedback, and so he's You can hear some of it coming through. He's
Yeah,
trying
sorry
to
about that.
trying to think coherently while there are loud machines running nearby. And I just got a text that our excavators are on the way here, so the noise might pick up a little bit.
Well, this is you are not living in a cloister, so I mean, this is the way it should be, which we'll get to here in just a second. So yes, people can hear. This is not only you're not doing something in the abstract. These are real things going on. So that which is great. Now, before we get to actually talking about some of the things that go on day to day at St. Dunstan's, you have a clear Anglican identity. And some schools who have a denominational identity, you know it because they post it on their website and they have an emblem on, on their school pamphlet that they have that says, we are Baptist or Presbyterian or so on. But that's about as far as it goes. You may have a chapel once a week where someone comes and speaks to the class, but that's it. But with St. Dunstan's, there is an identity that is suffused throughout the school. So how does that happen? How do you take and how do you make a school or take it from only having something plastered on the outside to being a core part of the culture, or really not just a core part, but I would say the core portion of the culture? Because, as plenty of people have pointed out, you don't have a culture without the cult
Mhm.
that really
Yeah,
begins. So,
exactly. Well said. Joseph Pieper has some great stuff to say about this. I'm going to leave most of this answer to Father Mark. The thing I'll start out with is when we were designing the school, there's an old Latin adage that we used as a kind of guiding light, making things like our schedule and our course scope and sequence and our vision of the school. That old adage is lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. The law of prayer is the law of faith, is the law of living. Another way of saying that is as one prays, so one believes, and so one lives. And so for us, prayer is the bedrock of what we do here. And as Anglicans, we have some really helpful tools that make that something easy to integrate here in our life together. And Father Mark, I will turn that over to you now.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is, on the we have a kind of on the one hand, on the other hand, to be clear, all baptized Christians are welcome to be students here. We don't have a denominational affiliation requirement for our students. We sort of there's a sort of it would be a bait and switch if we didn't say it up front, but we say you don't have to be Anglican to come here. You just have to be Anglican to be here, because what it means to be an Anglican most essentially is not checking a certain set of theological doctrines. Although that is not to say that there isn't Anglican theology and a kind of core of what it means to be an Anglican. But you can check all those boxes in theory and not be an Anglican if you're not praying as an Anglican with Anglicans in an Anglican context. And so we do ask that of all our students. If you're going to come here, you're gonna pray and sing morning and evening prayer together with us, and you're gonna the climax of life together when we launch the high school is going to be our Sunday morning communion service, and we have Holy Communion every Wednesday morning and on prayer book feast days and on the Feast of St. Dunstan as well, out here at campus. And so that's kind of at the heart of our life together. And we live under an Anglican rule of life, which is Holy Communion, the daily office of morning and evening prayer, and personal devotion. So those things are really central. And again, in wanting to envision a thick, coherent culture, uh, like you said, a culture. The church has to be at the heart of it, and so that was part of the recognition that if we're trying to recreate a thick, coherent culture, we can't do it as a non-denominational school. Now we are an independent, board-governed 501c3 nonprofit, with a normal independent school bylaws, except that the chaplain has to be resident in our diocese, and our diocesan bishop, is on our board ex officio in his office. He's not the board chair, but he is on our board. So we have this denominational affiliation that is, in particular, because as Anglicans, I can't, as a priest, just go off and celebrate the sacraments as a maverick. I'm a man under authority, and so I'm hired and fired, can be fired. I haven't been fired yet, but I could be fired by Thomas. But my sacramental ministry flows from my bishop, and so I have that sort of dual orientation. And so the school, we our life together is framed by prayer. We start and end our days in song and prayer, not so much to take time out of the beginning and the end of the day as to frame the whole day, and so that uh, even when we haven't fundamentally stopped to turn our heart and mind and our attention to God in explicit prayer and song, when they're working, when they're running the planer, when they're building over at the barn, that is part of what it looks like to live in the kingdom of heaven and to work for God's glory. And so the whole life is framed around prayer, and we are rooted in a place where we're not placeless. And that is, that is the great challenge of, I think, non-denominational Christian schools, is that you're always trying to figure out what I was always trying to figure out what we are, and not in a bad way always. I loved the school we taught at, and we actually had an awesome sort of ecumenical community among our faculty, and a really strong, vibrant community in a lot of ways. But I was never quite sure, what did it mean to be a non-denominational Christian school? How did we relate to the church? How did we relate to the place where we were? It was never totally clear to me.
Yeah. And I think what Father Mark has said is there are a number of pieces in there that make our life together here really special. And one thing, just bringing his first points from the beginning of our talk together to bear on this, being geographically together changes the game for us. Because we have our faculty families here and our students here and our faculty members here and neighbors close by, when we meet together for morning prayer and for evening prayer, people might be a quarter mile away on campus. Our campus is about 180 acres. It's an old apple and dairy farm that we're converting into the school. You might be across campus, but you can hear the calls to prayer, and within a minute or two, you can be there for the end of the day. And so we have an opportunity here that's just not readily available in other places because we are close together. So, in the early morning, we get up and we exercise together. And then after breakfast, we join for prayer. And before people go home to their various dinners, we meet again for prayer together. So there's this rhythm of life built into the schedule that's made possible by our geographical proximity, which makes coming from somewhere really, really possible. You can't come from nowhere. We have a sort of theological and pastoral angle that we're coming from, and our students get to be welcomed into that rhythm with us.
Something that I have thought about recently has been the question of whether a school can be non-denominational and based on mere Christianity, or whether having a denominational identity is better. And personally, I've come to think and believe that recently that having a core for your standard for the faith is important if you're going to communicate a clear culture to students, and not just to students, but to everyone who is there. And one of the beautiful things about the faith, particularly with regards to or within an Anglican identity in the prayer book, there's a lady named and I think it's a pseudonym, Carolyn Adams, who wrote a book called The Pattern of the Prayer Book. And she has a chart at the beginning that just lists how everything within the prayer book naturally comes together and enfolds the person from the beginning to the end. Not only the beginning of the morning prayer, but the beginning of faith with, baptism and so on, all the way down through even the burial of the dead. So, granted, hopefully you will not be conducting too many of those at the school as far as the burial goes, but that is a part of life. And so that is again, it's something that I think Americans don't have as much of a concept of because of our inherent sort of modern evangelical culture church is what you do on Sunday, or when I was growing up, Sunday and Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. Otherwise, that was it. Whereas this is a more, I mean, it's like it's being caught up into a wave of the faith that you are just, and it will, and if you will give yourself to it, it will sweep you out. So it's a beautiful thing, and so the keeping those young men with morning and evening prayer, that's honestly one of the first things that opened my eyes to what you were doing as being as being comprehensive in forming the nature of those young men.
Yeah, that's really what a beautiful image, being caught up on the wave. You just hit the nail right on the head with the language of formation. One of the things that makes training disciples difficult in a typical school context is that because of the educational history of the last 100 years, we have imbibed an idea of education that is more informational. You go to school to learn facts, right? To be have your intellect filled with things. But really, what's happening at school is our whole person is being addressed and shaped and formed. So school is part of Christian formation. It's not just a place you go to hear different ideas and read different books. And the prayer book tradition is, I think, uniquely powerful at forming really good disciples if they engage with the liturgy and with the common prayer services in an earnest way.
And the music. There's, the fact that you're teaching young men to sing. I have been privileged at times to be in places where I heard a group, and I love hearing mixed congregations sing as well, but there is something soul stirring, and I mean that exactly how I say it, soul stirring, about hearing men sing robustly the hymns and the chants of the faith that have been passed down, knowing that in some cases we are singing the same thing that St. Augustine was singing in North Africa. That is a gift to not be lightly received. I'm going to have to stop, or else I might actually, elevate here. So it's something to appreciate. But what many people think of when they think of what we've described so far is something closer to the caricature. If it's only about sitting in a classroom and being and having morning and evening prayer, then one might think, okay, that sounds just like what I was told monasteries are, where you just go and you just think about things and you hear ideas. But this is much more than that. This is like the Benedictine model. It's, yes, there is the holy leisure, the good kind of leisure where you're pursuing the faith, you're pursuing education and ideas, but also there's the work element. So could you tell us a little bit about just what a regular day in the life of St. Dunstan's is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to have to take lead on this one because Father Mark has some big diesel trucks driving past right now. So I'll give you both what things are like right now and what things are going to be like, Lord willing, when the high school opens. So right now, we have a small cohort of gap year students here in our inaugural Joshua program. They are here to grow in holiness and competence while they learn the building arts, what used to be known as the common arts, sometimes the servile arts. And there's actually a great tradition here. Oftentimes the servile arts and the liberal arts have been they've been viewed as opposing forces. You have the skills that go into thinking and speaking and taking holy leisure, and then you have the kind of dirty, blue collar jobs that we use to provide for ourselves. And that's not really the way that they were envisioned, let's say back in the Middle Ages, in the 10th century and the 11th century. Hugh of St. Victor has this great book called the Didascalicon, and he talks about education through a metaphor of marriage. Says that the goal of education is to see wisdom and eloquence married together in the soul of a person. And in this wedding metaphor, he says that there are 7 bridesmaids at the wedding of wisdom and eloquence. And those are the 7 liberal arts. You have the 3 arts and the 4 sciences, right? Grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and then arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And so they're the ones helping wisdom and eloquence get married. But he also says that they themselves have 7 assistants who help them at this wedding. And those assistants are the common arts. And those are the arts we all need in order to live. These are things that you can't get through life without. Things like building. Everyone needs a shelter, right? Medicine. Everyone needs their bodies taken care of. Agriculture. We all need food. Navigation. You have to find your way through the world. Commerce. You have to learn how to trade things for the things that you don't make. These are the common arts. And what's happened now in contemporary society, in the sort of industrial and post-industrial age, is we have offloaded. By the way, the common arts were called common because everybody needs them, right? Everyone has to have these things. We have offloaded most of the common arts to either robots or corporations. Most of these things we don't know how to make or produce for ourselves anymore, and that puts us at the mercy, in the words of one writer, at the mercy of people very far away from us who don't know who we are and don't care a thing about us. Our common needs now are in the hands of those outside of our community. And so what we're trying to do at St. Dunstan's is reunite these things together in the education of our young men, the liberal arts and the common arts. We want our young men to know how to make a great argument, to parse and diagram a sentence, to give a beautiful speech, to learn how to give a sermon and see if maybe they're called to the vocation of full-time ministry. But we also want them to know how to use a miter saw and to raise and butcher chickens and to keep a garden. We want them to know how to provide for their own personal needs in as many ways as we can. So we're building into the curriculum of our school a very rich introduction to the building and common arts. So in the Joshua program, which is running now, our young men are getting a kind of 201 introduction to carpentry. They're learning everything from how to put siding on a building and how to caulk and paint an interior to finish it up, to actually constructing the timber frame for our very majestic Great Hall. They've been working on that project since January. So they're getting some pretty advanced instruction in the building arts. And at the same time, they're learning a little bit about gardening and farming, and they're in the spiritual rhythm of the school. When the high school opens, the way that we've said it in the past is a Joshua program student gets as much instruction in the common arts in 1 year of the Joshua program as a high school student will get in 4 years of time while they're getting their liberal arts education here in high school. So we'll have days set apart in our school calendar for big projects around the farm and for the sort of beefed up shop class that we host here in the high school. And the goal is for our young men to graduate high school with the sort of skills, confidence, and competence needed to take care of a family and to contribute meaningfully to a church community. So while our young men will be very well equipped to go to college, if they decide to do that, they'll also have enough exposure to farming and the trades that if they decide they want to go into a more blue collar avenue, they'll have the imagination that's ready for that.
That is a good way of, I think, launching to the next thing that I was going to ask about, which does pertain to this. I saw on your website you mentioned under the section on further reading many books that I was familiar with, but one that's it's less known than others is one that is the biography of John Senior, The Restoration of Realism. I was taken aback by him years ago when I first encountered. So I encountered his work at a local thrift store. Someone had, on the books in between, I believe, some sort of Amish romance and a Dean Koontz novel. I saw his book about the death of Christian culture. So that intrigued me, and thankfully, and just so you know, the romance novel is in the wrong place. That was not my purpose in perusing, but just an aside. So I looked at it, and of course, his prose can be terse. He's nothing if not direct, and he expresses things very clearly. But I thought, to hear him teach would have been an amazing experience. And then, lo and behold, that book, The Restoration of Realism, was written. And I can see, having encountered him and what he did at the University of Kansas with their program, I can see how his ideas have taken hold and taken root with St. Dunstan. So could you talk about what does it mean for, what is realism? And we don't have to get into a long philosophical discourse on the history of realism, but what is realism as it pertains to St. Dunstan's, and how does it affect the work that you are doing there? And certainly feel free to talk about John Senior as much or as little as you would like.
Yeah, well, no, man, thank you for that introduction. I was actually just reading The Death of Christian Culture this morning, before working out with the students here. And that book is incredible, really incredible. And for those listeners who have not run across John Senior before, I would recommend not actually starting with his works themselves. The book that you mentioned, John Senior and the Restoration of Realism, is a much better starting point. John Senior can be pretty jarring, and there are some bones to spit out in his works, but he's a very prophetic voice, and the work that he accomplished with the Integrated Humanities program out at the University of Kansas is very stirring, very inspiring. I think people should know the story, and actually running across that story was part of what inspired us to build St. Dunstan's. Um, in short, so there's a great quote from one of his letters, from one of John Senior's letters, trying to describe what the problem with our age is. He was trying to take the great books education that he received at Columbia and use it to awaken young people's souls to the glories and splendors of the universe. He thought that, this was his story. He was a kind of, not even a nominal Christian. He ended up, he grew up in New York on Long Island. As a young man, he became very literate and very literary, went off to college, got his dissertation wrapped up under Mark Van Doren in English, and he became sort of a Hindu Buddhist. He became very interested in Eastern philosophy and converted to Christianity in his 30s. I'm skipping a bunch of the story, but he was converted basically through reading Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and running into the Christian fathers. And so he thought, if my students can just encounter the great books the way that I did, then they'll start to wake up and see what the world is really like. And what he found in teaching in Montana and then in Kansas was that his students had a hard time reading books. And this is how he said it in one of his letters. He said, my students can't read the great books because they've never read the good books. And they can't read the good books because they were never read their fairy tales. And they can't even really understand fairy tales because they've never encountered things before. John Senior saw these students in the 1970s totally enveloped in a media saturated world, in magazines and records and all of these mediating items, and they didn't know the constellations. They didn't know the names of trees. They weren't acquainted with the most basic things in the world around them, and so their imaginations were sterile. And so the incredible story of the Integrated Humanities program was an attempt by these three professors, John Senior and Dennis Quinn and Frank Nellick. They said, what if we designed a kind of college within the college and made a program designed at awakening the imaginations of our students? Their program's motto was Nascanter in Admiratione, let them be born in wonder. And they stripped away a lot of the paraphernalia of modern education and introduced their students to the best of what's been thought and said directly through memorizing poetry and listening to their professors talk about the great books together on stage, and learning to speak Latin together in science class. They had direct encounters with things. And then they did a lot of stuff off the beaten path. They'd go out at night and watch the stars together and learn about the constellations through the old Greek myths. They put on festivals and made their own clothes and learned how to dance. They got back in touch with folk culture, essentially, because folk culture requires you to start creating and producing things instead of just consuming them. And the outcome of this program is really phenomenal. The students really were awakened to reality and to God's presence in the world. This was all at a secular university. But just because of this kind of teaching that their professors gave them, they called it the advocacy method. Instead of trying to pick apart and destroy the works that they were reading, the professors advocated for the author's point of view. And the students were just supposed to try and understand, what is it this author is saying? That advocacy method transformed the lives of the students who came through the program and really did wake them up to reality. Yeah, really incredible story. For us, John Senior's example reminds us that there are fundamental things that students should learn first. They need a kind of poetic awakening to the world as it's created before they start getting into more abstract things. And so our program at St. Dunstan's is designed to give our students rich encounters of reality through things like walking in the forest and learning how to fell a tree and reciting poetry in groups. A lot of the stuff that the classical schooling world has already started to tap into, but we're going to lean much more heavily into those direct encounters with reality in the poetic mode than a lot of schools have the time and ability to do.
That is a very helpful answer. I know another school, a Roman Catholic school, that some who were influenced by him started in Wyoming Catholic College. They do some very interesting things with along the same lines as what you're talking about. I remember reading that some of them, for their incoming freshmen, they go, I think, on about a 3-week hike through the Rockies, through some large patch of what we would say wilderness, beautiful creation, and they are allowed to, for some of them for the first time, to really be in touch with God's world as he made it, without a lot of mediating technological help. You don't have someone holding your hand. You don't have an app that tells you, oh, this tree is this thing.
Yeah.
Or this mushroom is edible, although I don't know that they have mushrooms in the Rockies, but you get the point. So that's that kind of thing, though, actually does awaken us and allow us to see truth and to understand the world as it is in a way that only being in a sterile classroom, there's nothing wrong with classrooms, but classrooms are protected. They are sterile in a sense that those do not. So the combination, and this is what I hear you all are doing, students, they grow the good kind of calluses on their hands, while also learning how to grow the right kind of protection around their souls.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful way of putting it. We want calluses on their hands, not on their hearts, right? We want their hearts to be open and alive to God's created order. There's an old saying of the church fathers that God has 2 books. You have the first book, which is the created order. That's the first thing God's ever said about himself. And then the second is the Holy Scriptures. And we want our students to be alert and alive to both of those things, which means they need to encounter both of those things all the time. One thing that Wyoming Catholic does really well that we also do here, Wyoming Catholic has realized that the digital world is a huge distraction for young people. And so they have a very strict technology policy at Wyoming Catholic, so that while their students are out on that 3-week backpacking trip, looking at the stars and talking to each other and learning about nature and playing music, they're not constantly looking down at a screen. And so they can encounter and remember the things around them. And the same thing is true here at St. Dunstan's. We have a policy of digital poverty. Our students don't have personal digital devices while they're here. And the main reason for that is there's a gigantic opportunity cost that comes with 7 to 9 hours a day of screen time, which is now the sort of standard or average for adolescents. There's just a lot to do in the world that's meaningful and beautiful and wonderful. And if you're looking down at TikTok reels, you're not going to encounter those things in the real world. So we put those digital distractions aside while we're here at the school, and then try to get our students out into God's created order as much as possible, both outside of the classroom and then as part of the classroom. We try to make the created order the gateway to all of our subjects that we teach here. And part of that is just, it's wonderful, right? This is the way that you show somebody that the world is an incredible place. and it's not a place to be bored by, right? God has given us so many things. There's a great short Robert Louis Stevenson poem called Happy Thought. It's very short. It just goes, the world is so full of a number of things. I'm sure we should all be as happy as kings. And there's a kind of spur there, that if we're not as happy as kings, right? If we find that we are ourselves down in the dumps all the time and maybe somewhat depressed, maybe it's because we're not paying attention to the variety and the wonder that God has put in the world.
Well, and that actually was a question that I was going to ask, which you've already answered regarding technology. What many people, when they hear about, having a digital poverty policy, they think, of course, or some would say, "Oh, so you don't believe in communication or something like that." But I heard it loud and clear. Well, not loud, but it was clear. I mean, that planer was not something that was powered by a hamster, or by one of your Joshua program students, peddling something. I mean, that was an electrical planer. If unless he's got very strong legs. So so that's, you are not against electrical power. You
Right.
are not against the gifts that God has given us, that we are able to harness well for the purpose of what you are trying to do, which is to form young men as faithful, strong, godly men walking in the way of Christ. But you are strictly limiting things that will distract a young man from becoming a godly, faithful, wise man.
Exactly, and so well said. The point of limiting digital devices here is not to. It's not because we're afraid of them. It's not because we say, "Oh, this is something that's going to somehow damage our young men, and we should just keep them away from it." There is some truth to that, but for us, we're always asking the question: what are we trying to do with our students? What are we trying to accomplish? And will the tool that we're talking about help achieve those ends? Will our young men become more intelligent, more focused, more self-controlled, more joyful by their encounters with this tool in this particular context? Or will that tool pull them away from the kind of virtues that we're trying to build in them? So great example. Yeah, then you've already brought up a really good point, right? Technology does not just mean computing technology, but it's so prolific now. Generally, when people say, "Oh, you don't like technology," they're just talking about computers. Last week, one of our pieces of heavy equipment here broke down, and one of our students got to take apart the body of this machine and get into the gas tank and get into the fuel lines and clear out all the sediment and deposits and try to figure out, why is this fuel pump pumping oxygen into the engine instead of pumping diesel fuel into the engine. There's a lot of technology in that lesson, a lot of creativity and problem solving. And oftentimes what's actually going on our digital devices, on our personal handhelds, is not any kind of problem solving or creativity. We're just punching buttons in apps that have been designed for us to do a particular thing. And so there's a kind of mindlessness in most digital interaction that we're trying to steer our young men away from. Now, are they going to use computers and phones in the rest of their life? Yes, of course. Most of them have already done lots of that. But what we're saying is, in this particular context, where Christian formation and discipleship and the enculturation of souls is our goal, we're going to say that tool's not actually the most helpful thing. And we're going to choose challenges and missions and projects that engage the souls and the intellects of our students in the most powerful possible way.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's helpful to remember that the purpose of St. Dunstan's Academy is not to remove boys from mainstream culture. It's to send out men who are well formed. And so when you do the kind of backwards design, if you want to send out well formed men, what do they need? Then you backwards design what it should look like, what is necessary developmentally. And so then you're always asking, this is in any school and in parenting and anything else, what is a developmentally appropriate challenge for this person at this stage of development? And it's basically I would add to all of what Thomas said by saying that a smartphone is not a developmentally appropriate challenge for an adolescent or for a child. It's usually not a developmentally appropriate challenge for an adult either. I think one thing to note is that most adults do not use their smartphones especially well, and most adults, when you say that to them, will say, "Oh yeah, that is true. I have to have it because of XYZ," which is usually not true, just for the record. But I choose to have it because of this, and everybody has to make a cost benefit choice, right? So it might be worth it for them. But it is really hard for me to use it well, and maybe I don't always, and maybe I don't ever. And then we say, well, we should give it to a 15-year-old. That's kind of crazy. Um, it's not a developmentally appropriate challenge for a 15-year-old. And what we do is we for an adolescent to develop well during adolescence, they need a maximally coherent culture to exist in, and they also need maximal independence, freedom, and responsibility. Because, and for both for the same reason, because they're leaving the home and they're moving into the broader world, and so they need coherence to say that the what Luigi Giussani calls the parental hypothesis, the explanatory hypothesis of reality, that like the picture of life that parents have given them. They're testing it in adolescence. They're moving out of the home, and they need a culture that affirms the vision of the good life. But they also need independence, freedom, and responsibility to test the tradition themselves. And so they need to be free to do that. And the sort of irony of our culture is that we have minimal independence, and we have minimal sort of coherence of culture. So we're sort of giving the worst of all things. The other thing, last thing to say, is when you're thinking about sending out well-formed young men, you're thinking about the person, not the product. So you're not thinking about what kind of a paper can this student produce as a junior per se. You're thinking about what kind of a person produces a good paper. Um, and when you make that shift to think about we're actually developing a person who will then have capacities and abilities, then how you use or don't use technology changes. If all you're thinking about is how quickly can we produce a certain given product, then you're going to want to have maximal technology at all times. So if you want to say how quickly can this human being produce a C minus paper, well, the way that you do that is you put a prompt into Claude or Chat GPT, and out pops a C minus paper. Um, like, and that's going to become increasingly, maybe it'll be a C plus next year, and eventually an A minus paper or something. So if all you're thinking about is the product, then you're always going to want to have a maximal use of any kind of sort of so-called productivity technology. But a student learns nothing from that experience, right? The person is not formed in any meaningful way. And the same thing goes with some of the technology here. We're not always going to use our own sawmill here because it's inefficient and we have to build buildings. And we're not always going to hand hew. In fact, we're not going to hand hew all that often. Sometimes, but you learn things from hand hewing and from using your own sawmill and from chopping your own wood that you don't learn if you just purchase from the sawmill down the road, which we do a lot of because it's super necessary and efficient for our building. That you don't learn from just turning the thermostat up a couple degrees, and so there's always a sort of, again, what is the benefit to shaping this particular person? What kind of a person is going to leave our school? And I do think the irony is, it's not an irony, I guess. But the interesting thing that there's a number of studies coming out suggesting that the higher your use of AI, the stupider you become. That your actual functional intelligence is negatively impacted by the use of AI. That's not surprising to me at all. That seems like it should be the most obvious thing in the world. But we're already getting some data on that, which is good because some people don't believe anything unless they have empirical data to prove it, which is sort of a problem in and of itself. But given that that's so, then the question is, okay, unquestionably, our students will end up using AI and digital technology, many of them anyway, in lots of places. It's going to become ubiquitous and unavoidable. Even if you're trying not to use it, the things you're using will be using it. So, but the question is, what kind of a person, what kind of an education do they need to become masters of technology instead of becoming enslaved to their technology, to being mastered by technology? So those are the questions we ask. And I just think, again, I've said any educator who's not doesn't at least have some skepticism towards AI is either incredibly naive and inexperienced, or stupid. I don't know. I mean, if you've had any experience in education over the last 20 years, you've experienced, Silicon Valley, our tech overlords sending their kids to low tech Montessori schools in the greater San Francisco Valley while they push, Chromebooks and free gifts, of Chromebooks and iPads onto students. And the learning outcomes from ed tech over the last 20 or 30 years are null. They're negative. They're not neutral. They're bad. the more you put Chromebooks in the classroom, the worse your outcomes get. And I'm sure there are exceptions and all that stuff, but that is the overwhelming story that the data tells. And so I just have no patience for people. Well, how will they learn to use AI? Well, AI is going to teach them how to use AI. You don't need to worry about that. That's not a question. How will they not be stupid is the question you should be asking. How will your children be well-formed, mature adults who are able to competently use technology? That's the question you should be asking. And usually that actually means limiting their technology in formative years. Anyway, I'll stop rambling now, or ranting, I guess is actually what I've been doing.
That is quite all right. So for all who want your young men to not be stupid, uh, quoth Father Mark, nevermore, then check out St. Dunstan's. That's but seriously, this is. I mean, I say that in
We need
jest.
to end on a more positive note. So.
Well, the formation of young men is a general abysmal failing in our communities. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk with both of you is that I want people to know and to be inspired if they may not be able to do or to send their kids, their sons to St. Dunstan's, but there are things that they can take from what you've said and apply in their own lives, unless there are prophetic voices, not only who speak out against problems, but provide adequate solutions. The problems do not heal themselves. So, what you are saying, I don't actually consider a negative, because this is a vision for what is possible. So, probably the last thing I would say, just in brief, or I'll ask, what is in 20 years or in 30 years? What is the thing that you both would like to look back on and say, when you're standing and with the 30-year St. Dunstan's uh, gathering? What is it that you want to look back and give and have the most gratitude for?
Well, the first thing is just the goal of the school in general. We want the young men who come through here to learn how to love the Lord their God with all their heart, all their soul, all their mind, and all their strength, and to learn how to love their neighbors as themselves. That's God's calling on their life. We recite it at every one of our communion services here. And 30 years from now, I would love to see our alumni at our gatherings at the Feast of St. Dunstan. We just had our fourth annual big event here on this past Saturday. I want to be able to see them gather at that feast and see that their hearts are aflame for Jesus Christ, and that the education that they had here was part of the way God cultivated that love in them. That's the first thing I would say. But then the second thing I would love to see is 30 years from now, I would love to see that for 30 years, we have not treated the 14, 15, 16, and 17-year-old young men here as if they were 11 years old, which is the typical thing in our culture now. Our 18-year-old young men and their schedule and their responsibilities tend to look very similar to their 11-year-old little brothers. I would love to see that we treated these young men as what they are, incredible gifts to the kingdom of God, who have the capacity and the talents to do great things and to become real assets to the going forth of the gospel. That's not going to happen unless we put more responsibility into the hands of these young men, unless we treat them as if they're not boys anymore. So that's my prayer, is that we can do that faithfully for the next 30 years and not be worried and intimidated and cowed by the many reasons people say don't do that, right? Safetyism can destroy a lot of good things. So I hope that we can stay the course.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I hope we stay faithful. We're in a stage of, we'll always be in a stage of need, but we're in a stage of felt need now, right? Like we're building this campus, we're drawing the people together to help us, have the funds to build the great hall, and we're looking to fill seats in our student body classroom. But we've had tremendous support, tremendous momentum, and I expect that very soon we will be. We already are in a position of great abundance, but that we will have what we need, and we're going to have different problems, and the problems I think are going to be temptations eventually towards mission drift, and so that's every institution that's successful then has to run the risks of success, and so in 30 years, I pray that we will have been shown to be safe, to have stayed faithful um, through the temptations of need, and then through the temptations of success and abundance. So, yeah.
Well, Thomas and Father Mark, thank you both very much for taking time to join me today. It's been a delight. We've gone down some roads I expected, some I didn't expect, but all of them have been fantastic. So thank you very much, and the Lord's blessings on you both and on St. Dunstan's in the work that you do.
Thank you,
Thank you
Matt.
so much.